Chapter 9 closed with a boundary worth repeating. The mechanics of a governance system can be taught, but the capacity to act honestly under pressure must be practiced. That observation points directly to the people who sit closest to that pressure, not the executives who set the strategy, and not the frontline teams who execute it, but the managers in between who are responsible for making one world legible to the other. Chapter 10 is about that role. Governance intent does not travel from the boardroom to the boundary on its own. It requires translation, someone who can take an abstract mandate and convert it into a specific operational commitment, and someone who can take the evidence from that commitment and return it to leadership in a form they can actually use. The manager is that translation layer. Understanding what that function demands, where it typically breaks down, and what tools support it is what this chapter is built to deliver. Chapter 9 drew a clear line. AI accelerates the work of assurance without displacing the human accountability that makes it real. The question that naturally follows is who holds that accountability in practice, not at the board level where strategy is set, and not on the front line where the work is done, but in the space between those two worlds where intent either becomes operational reality or quietly stops. That space belongs to the manager. Chapter 10 is built around a single governing idea. The manager is a translation layer. Strategic mandates travel through the manager to become boundary-level capability. Operational evidence travels back through the manager to become intelligence leadership can actually use. When that translation works, governance closes its loop. When it does not, the paper system and the living system drift, and no amount of framework sophistication at either end of the organization will close the gap. This chapter is about what translation actually requires: the position, the discipline, the tools, and the cultural conditions that determine whether intent becomes action or stalls somewhere in the middle. The boardroom conversation and the frontline conversation happen in different languages about different things, and the distance between them is wider than most governance frameworks acknowledge. Upstairs, the language is strategic. Risk appetite, resilience, governance frameworks, trusted releases, no surprises. These are real commitments with real consequences. But a frontline team member on Monday morning does not need a risk appetite statement. They need to know what to do when a counterparty system slows, which decision they are authorized to make without escalation, and what the recovery sequence looks like when the documented path does not work. Without a connection between those two worlds, intent stalls. The board issues a mandate. The mandate becomes a policy. The policy gets circulated. Teams acknowledge receipt. And the actual behavior at the operational boundary, the place where the mandate either holds or it does not, remains unchanged. The gap is not a failure of good intentions. It is a failure of translation. And translation requires a specific kind of person, positioned at a specific place in the organization. Managers sit at the exact boundary where governance intent meets operational reality. That is not a figurative description, it is a structural one. They are the people positioned at the seam between what the organization has decided it will do and what the organization is actually capable of doing on any given day. The function that position requires is transformation without displacement. A manager's job is to take abstract strategic intent and convert it into concrete operational capability, without simply telling teams what the strategy says, and without taking the work away from the people who need to own it. They translate mandate into action and translate evidence back into language leadership can use. The reality of that position is that it is relentlessly tested. Managers are the ones called when a release goes wrong, when a supplier fails, when a control that looked green in the last audit turns out to be missing in practice. They are the people the organization relies on to know the difference between what the paper says and what the operation actually does. Whether they are equipped to make that judgment, and whether the culture supports them in reporting it accurately, determines whether the governance system closes its loop or decorates it. The conventional answer to the translation problem is documentation. Dashboard sections, track deliverables, policy acknowledgements, status reports. All of it cascading down from strategic intent toward the operational boundary. It looks like governance. It functions as wallpaper. These artifacts specify what should happen. They do not produce a change in behavior at the specific operational boundary, which is the only place that matters. A team that receives a new policy document knows what the organization wants. That knowledge does not automatically translate into a revised runbook, a clearer escalation path, or a new drill that tests whether the documented failover procedure actually works. The trap is precisely that the artifacts feel like governance. Producing them creates the impression that the translation has occurred. But strategic intent delivered through documentation alone does not become operational reality until someone takes that documentation to a specific boundary, asks what it requires of the team at that boundary, and makes the concrete changes that close the gap between the stated position and the actual capability. That work cannot be delegated to a template. The COVID-19 vaccine rollout offered one of the most compressed and consequential tests of translation under pressure in recent organizational history. What separated successful execution from failure was not the quality of the executive declarations or the strength of the contract language. It was whether managers at hundreds of operational handoff boundaries had converted those declarations into exact operational constraints before the pressure arrived. Where execution succeeded, the distinguishing features were operational rather than strategic. Cold chain telemetry that flagged temperature excursions before product was compromised, pre-designed exception handling that gave local teams clear decision authority without requiring escalation, rapid local decision-making that did not wait for central approval when conditions changed. These were not improvised responses. They were the product of managers who had worked out in advance what the strategic commitments required at each specific boundary. Where execution failed, the pattern was consistent. Executive declarations that had not been converted into concrete operational capability, policy updates that arrived without accompanying changes to how teams actually worked. The lesson is not that strategy is unimportant. It is that strategy only matters operationally at the point where a manager has translated it into something a team can act on without ambiguity. Managers working at operational boundaries do not experience governance as a unified mandate. They experience it as three competing demands arriving simultaneously from different directions, and each one with legitimate urgency behind it. The create dimension pulls toward enabling new capabilities and moving faster, the growth pressure, the product team asking to accelerate a release, the executive push for market position. The protect dimension pulls in a different direction, enforcing access rules, running recovery drills, making sure the fraud checks actually fire. The deliver dimension adds a third pull, maintaining service availability, managing backlogs, keeping the operation running through shift rotations and degraded conditions. Each of these dimensions is real. Each one taken alone would justify a different set of decisions at the same boundary. This is what makes the manager's position genuinely difficult. The tension is not a sign that something is wrong. It is the normal condition of operating at the boundary between value creation and operational discipline. What the DVMS framework provides is not a resolution of that tension, but a way of organizing it. The three-lens approach introduced in the next slide turns competing demands into a structured question that a team can actually answer. When governance mandates arrive at an operational boundary without structure, they tend to generate either paralysis or improvisation. Neither is governance. What converts a mandate into executable work is asking three specific questions about the specific boundary in front of the team. The first question is about the target. What outcome are we trying to create or preserve here specifically? Not in general, not for the organization at large, at this boundary for this team in this operating condition. The second question is about evidence. How can we tell, through numbers and observable behavior, whether we are achieving it? This is where the QOQM discipline introduced in Chapter 7 becomes a practical tool. It gives the evidence question a structure that both the team and leadership can read without translation. The third question is about reality. What capabilities must be present at this boundary so the team can move quickly and safely? Applied together to a specific boundary, these three questions do something that documentation alone cannot. They organize the tension between create, protect, and deliver into a decision the team can make, and they produce the kind of boundary-level clarity that makes governance real rather than rhetorical. The path from a board mandate to a team's daily practice involves 4 distinct translation steps, and each one can fail independently. Understanding where the chain breaks is what allows a manager to fix the right problem rather than the most visible one. The first translation converts an abstract mandate into a specific boundary, finding the vulnerability that the mandate is actually trying to address, rather than distributing the mandate uniformly across the organization. The second translation converts the boundary into an outcome and a measure, defining what success looks like at that specific point, in terms both the implementer and the auditor can verify. The third translation converts the outcome into a capability assessment, identifying what needs to be present at the boundary for the team to deliver the outcome under realistic operating conditions. The fourth translation converts the capability assessment into daily practice, the specific changes to runbooks, drills, decision authorities, and review routines that make the capability real rather than documented. Most governance failures can be located in one of these four translations. The mandate was issued, but the boundary was never identified. The boundary was identified, but the outcome was left vague. The capability gap was recognized, but nothing changed about how the team actually worked. Knowing which translation failed tells you what intervention is needed. Applying the first two translations to Meridian's settlement boundary makes the abstract concrete. The mandate arrives in board language. Critical customer journeys must be resilient to single-component failures. That is a legitimate governance commitment. It is also completely non-actionable until someone does the work of Translation 1. Translation 1 asks, of all the boundaries in the operation, which specific one is most likely to harm a customer right now if a single component fails? For Meridian, the answer is the settlement boundary. The point where processing obligations must be met on time, even when a named supplier or system component is unavailable. Naming that boundary precisely is what makes the next step possible. Translation 2 then asks what success looks like at that boundary in terms both the team and an auditor can verify. For Meridian's settlement boundary, the outcome is that obligations are met on time, even when the primary path is unavailable. The measure is failover time, observable, testable, and directly connected to the promise the organization has made. An implementer and an auditor reading that outcome statement are looking at the same target, which means assurance and delivery are finally speaking the same language. Defining the target is the easier half of translation. Converting it into something the team can rely on under pressure is where the real work happens. Translation 3 asks what capabilities must actually be present at the boundary for the outcome to hold. For Meridian's settlement boundary, that means asking whether failover patterns are clear in the design capability, whether the change process requires testing the alternate path before it is needed, and whether the execute capability gives on-call teams explicit authority to failover without escalation. These are not documentation questions, they are operational readiness questions, and the answers often surface gaps that the formal record does not show. Translation 4 is where those capability gaps become specific, executable actions. Creating a revised runbook for the alternate path, updating the change review process to include a settlement impact question, scheduling a drill for the next available low-volume window. The emphasis on unpermissioned operational upgrades matters here. Managers do not need enterprise-wide authorization to revise a runbook, update a review question, or schedule a drill. These are changes within the team's authority, and waiting for permission to make them is itself a translation failure, governance intent arriving at the boundary and stopping there, rather than becoming practice. When a boundary keeps generating incidents after the root cause has been identified and addressed, the instinct is to look harder for the cause. The more useful question is whether a capability is missing, because recurring failures at the same boundary, despite repeated fixes, are almost always a capability problem, rather than a control problem. Vague policies and improvised exceptions signal weak governance. No one at the boundary has clear decision rights, so each situation gets resolved ad hoc. Artifacts collected without consequence signal weak assurance. Evidence is flowing into reviews but not changing anything, which means the assurance loop is decorative rather than functional. Constantly reinventing solutions and relying on tribal knowledge signal design gaps. The boundary has never been blueprint, so the team rebuilds the solution from memory each time the situation recurs. Unexplained timing and post-reviews focused on disaster avoidance rather than learning signal change problems. The organization is processing incidents without extracting the structural lessons that would prevent recurrence. Reading these symptoms as capability indicators rather than performance failures changes the intervention entirely. The question shifts from who failed to what the boundary is missing, and that question has a constructive answer. One of the most practically useful ideas in this chapter is also one of the most straightforward. Managers do not need new meetings to build a better governance system. They need to shift the purpose of the meetings they already run. An incident review that ends with a timeline and an action list is not useless, but it is incomplete. Connecting that timeline to the QOQM tree, testing whether the safeguards that were supposed to fire actually fired, and updating a design pattern or runbook based on what the review found turns the same meeting into an assurance feedback loop. The time investment is identical. The output is fundamentally different. The same logic applies to supplier reviews. A review that rehashes explanations for previous failures and produces another set of commitments is a status exercise. A review that explicitly tests whether drills, runbooks, and recovery plans match the outcome statement at the relevant boundary is governance. The upgrade is not about frequency or formality, it is about what the routine is oriented toward. Status reporting and assurance feedback look similar on a calendar. They produce entirely different organizational learning. Managers working within existing organizations often feel constrained by the sense that real change requires enterprise permission, a new program, a new tool, a mandate from above. That sense is frequently mistaken, and acting on it is one of the main reasons governance intent stalls at the translation layer. The first lever is attention. The questions a manager repeatedly asks shape what the team notices and prioritizes. A manager who consistently asks what outcome a given activity is protecting trains a team to see governance as purposeful rather than procedural. That shift in perception is available immediately, without anyone's approval. The second lever is interpretation. When a new framework requirement arrives, a manager can present it as a compliance burden or as a prompt for genuine learning about a specific boundary. The framing is the manager's choice, and the framing determines whether teams engage with the intent or just fulfill the letter. The third lever is example. A manager who demonstrates fewer surprises and clearer escalation paths creates a visible model for the teams around them. Adjacent teams observe the practice and its results, and the culture shifts without a formal initiative. None of these levers requires a title change, a budget, or a program launch. They are available to any manager at any boundary, and their cumulative effect on organizational governance is larger than most formal interventions. The translation layer is also where organizational culture makes itself undeniable. Two managers facing the same broken control at the same boundary will produce entirely different outcomes depending on how their environment has taught them to treat evidence of failure. In the punitive path, intent is treated as a standard against which teams are evaluated. When a control breaks, the organizational response is to identify who failed to maintain it. Teams learn quickly that surfacing operational flaws is costly, not because they are dishonest, but because the system has trained them to shape evidence rather than report it. Governance becomes a performance rather than a practice. In the developmental path, intent is treated as a shared promise to customers. A broken control is not evidence of failure, it is a trigger for learning. Capability gaps become problems to solve rather than vulnerabilities to conceal. The assurance loop closes because reporting accurately is safer than managing appearances. The choice between these paths is not made in policy documents. It is made in the room when stakes are real and ambiguous, when a manager receives evidence of a gap and decides, in that moment, what to do with it. Every one of those moments is a signal to the team about what the organization actually values. The aggregate of those signals is the culture. Chapter 10 closes with a reframe that is the culmination of everything the chapter has argued. The final slide positions the manager not as a ticket handler or a metric defender, but as an assurance governor, a prism through which strategic intent and operational evidence pass in both directions, continuously, keeping the paper system and the living system accountable to each other. The 4 statements on the right of the slide are worth taking as a professional standard. You are not just handling tickets or defending metrics you do not trust. You ensure operational reality is known at the boundary. You ensure evidence reaches the people who can actually act on it. You close the loop. Those 4 commitments, practiced consistently at any boundary in any organization, are what governance by assurance looks like from the inside. The translations are where the system either learns or stalls. In the next chapter, we will examine how this translation function scales, what changes, what stays the same, and what new pressures emerge when the organization grows beyond what any individual manager can hold.